This is 99% Invisible. I'm Roman Mars. On the evening of May 31st, 2009, 216 passengers, 3 pilots, and 9 flight attendants boarded an Air France flight in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The flight was headed across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris.
A warning, this story might not be a good one to listen to if you're sitting on a plane right now.
That's producer Katie Mingle letting you know that the closest exit could be behind you.
The plane that took off that evening from Rio was an Airbus 330. The takeoff was unremarkable. The plane reached a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The passengers read and watched movies and slept. As they flew over the Atlantic Ocean, passing the equator,
there was a lot of thunderstorm activity. Quite typical. Nothing really unusual about that.
That's William Longavisha. He wrote an article for Vanity Fair about this flight and has written extensively about aviation. He also used to be a pilot.
So I spent many, many thousands of hours in cockpits.
Which means he's particularly well suited to tell the story of Air France Flight 447.
It was a long flight. So they had 2 co-pilots, known as first officers, and 1 captain.
They would fly the plane in shifts, 2 of them flying while 1 slept.
We know that the flight proceeded normally for several hours.
And then,
with no communication to the ground or air traffic control, it suddenly disappeared.
Some pieces of the plane and several bodies were found days later floating in the Atlantic. But it would be 2 more years before most of the wreckage was found deep in the ocean. All 228 people on board had died.
When the wreckage was found, they also recovered the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorders.
And they were in good shape.
The recordings were able to tell a story about how Flight 447 ended up in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
And the story they told was about what happened when the automated system flying the plane suddenly shut off and the pilots were left surprised, confused, and ultimately unable to fly their own plane.
Automation in flight has been around for a long time. The first so-called autopilot was invented by the Sperry Corporation in 1912, and it allowed the plane to fly straight and level without the pilot's intervention.
In the 1950s, the autopilots got better,
so that you could program an autopilot to follow a route, not just to keep the wings level. This was making the pilot's job a lot easier.
But there was still a lot to think about in the cockpit of an airplane.
Controlling the electric systems, controlling the hydraulic systems.
And because of all this, most planes had 3 people in the cockpit, 2 pilots and an engineer.
Flight engineers sat behind the pilots, and they manipulated and managed these increasingly complex systems.
But by the 1970s, all of those complex systems were also automated, and flight engineers lost their necessity and their jobs.
By this time, the jet engine had replaced the piston engine, making planes much more reliable. And studies were showing that most accidents were being caused not by mechanical error, but by human error.
And a French company called Airbus thought that they could make planes safer by letting automation carry an even bigger part of the burden of flying.
Airbus was a leader. Airbus has always been quite radical in its design philosophy.
Led by a guy named Bernard Ziegler, Airbus set out to design what they hoped would be the safest plane yet, a plane that even the worst pilots could fly with ease.
Bernard Ziegler, he famously said that he was building an airplane that his concierge could fly.
Ziegler's plane not only had autopilot, it also had what's called a fly-by-wire system.
So this can get a bit technical, but basically an autopilot just does what a pilot tells it to do. Fly-by-wire is a computer-based control system that can interpret what the pilot wants to do and then do it smoothly and safely. So if the pilot pulls back on his or her stick, the fly-by-wire system will say, "Oh, I see that you want to pitch up, and here, I'll do it for you at just the right angle and rate."
Importantly, the fly-by-wire system will also protect you from getting into an aerodynamic stall. So in a car, a stall happens when the engine stops turning, but in a plane, stalling is different.
Basically getting so slow that the wings no longer function correctly and the airplane, loses altitude, put it that way.
A stall in a plane can happen when the nose of the plane is pitched up at too steep an angle. A steep angle can cause the plane to lose lift and start to descend.
Stalling in a plane is not good. Stall for long enough and you will crash. But fly-by-wire automation makes it impossible to do, as long as it's on.
Unlike autopilot, the fly-by-wire system cannot be turned on and off by the pilot.
You can't turn this automation off.
But here's the thing.
It can turn itself off.
And that's exactly what it did on May 31st, 2009, as Flight 447 flew through the night sky over the Atlantic Ocean.
At some point, having flown normally for a few hours, the captain had gone back to sleep.
This meant the two co-pilots were in control of the plane.
They encountered some weather. It wasn't rough. They never hit significant turbulence.
So far, nothing out of the ordinary. And then,
suddenly, they lost airspeed indications.
A pressure probe on the outside of the plane had iced over. The automation could no longer tell how fast the plane was going.
At this point, autopilot disconnected.
At the same time, the fly-by-wire system degraded by one step.
So the autopilot turned off and the fly-by-wire system shifted into a different mode, a mode that did not protect against aerodynamic stall.
None of this was ideal, but it also wasn't a reason to panic, according to William. The plane was still basically flying straight and steady.
The airplane was not upset. Had they done nothing, they would have done exactly what they needed to do. Nothing.
But that's not what happened. The co-pilot in the right seat put his hand on his control stick, a little joystick-like thing to his right.
And he pulled it back.
Not just a little. He pulled it 3/4 of the way back.
Why he did that is a major question.
Perhaps he was startled or reacting to some turbulence. It's important to note that he did not tell the other pilot in the cockpit, the guy in the left seat, what he had just done. If he had, maybe his co-pilot would have known the dangerous situation they were about to be in.
In an Airbus, the two pilots have separate control sticks that move independently of each other. In other commercial airplanes, the controls would move in unison so that you would actually feel the moves your co-pilot was making on their controls. This design variation may also have contributed to what was about to become a very bad situation. In any case, as the pilot in the right seat pulled back on his stick,
the airplane put its nose up and started to soar upward.
When stall protections are in place, the plane won't just warn you not to pitch it at such an extreme angle. It physically will not let you do it. But remember, the plane had shifted into a mode in which it wasn't offering that underlying protection.
As the angle got steeper and steeper, the air couldn't flow smoothly across the wings, and the plane began to stall.
The plane was angled up, trying to gain altitude, but it actually began to lose altitude.
A warning began to sound. The plane couldn't prevent a stall, but it could still warn that a stall was happening.
It said stall, stall, stall.
It would have sounded like this.
Stall, stall. Stall, stall.
And you'd think that if you heard this alarm, someone would say, "Hey, I think we might be stalling." But this never happened.
At one point, one of the co-pilots did say, "Get your nose down."
But he didn't say we've stalled. And the man in the right seat who was flying the airplane, the junior co-pilot, he would put the nose down a couple of times and then bring it right back up again.
The co-pilots began to ring frantically for the captain to come into the cockpit. At one point, one of them says, "Where is he?"
The airplane was shaking. All kinds of alarms were going off.
1 minute and 38 seconds after the episode started, the captain came into the cockpit and asked, "What's going on here?"
The co-pilots did not say, "We're in a stall." Instead, one of them said, quote, "We've completely lost control of the airplane and we don't understand anything. We've tried everything."
The captain had walked into a difficult scene to understand. Everyone was confused. Were they descending or climbing? At times, they couldn't seem to figure it out. Finally, they seemed to realize they're in a fast descent, losing thousands of feet per minute. But why? They couldn't figure out why.
The captain never assessed correctly what was going on. He was obviously trying to. He wasn't there to drink coffee or suck his thumb. But he was never able to figure out what was going on, even though it should have been amply obvious what was going on.
But for whatever reason, it wasn't obvious to them what was going on. They didn't know they were in a stall. If they had realized it, Williams says, the fix would have been clear. It's basic. It's Pilot School 101.
The recovery would have required them to put the nose down. Power doesn't matter. Just get the nose down, get it below the horizon, regain a flying speed, and then pull out of the ensuing dive.
The plane continued falling down at a jaw-dropping pace, losing several thousands of feet per minute. But since they started at 37,000 feet, for a while there was still time for a recovery.
So for quite a long time, a normal crew would have been able to recover. And at the very end, at around 16,000 feet, the best crew in the world only probably would have been able to recover. And below that altitude, no crew would have been able to recover because they simply didn't have the space beneath them to execute the dive before hitting the water. But in any case, they never tried to do it. And so they rode this airplane down, expressing confusion the whole time, and finally expressing certainty that they were going to die.
4 minutes and 20 seconds after the incident started,
they pancaked into the water at a very high descent rate, and of course it killed everyone instantly.
Six years after the crash of Flight 447, what's clear is that the pilots didn't understand what was happening to them. The big question is how. How could they have a computer yelling stall at them and not understand they were in a stall?
There were various things that contributed to the crash of 447, but automation, which has overwhelmingly made airline travel safer, also played a role in this accident.
For however much automation has helped the airline passenger by increasing safety, it has had some negative consequences. In this case, it's quite clear that these pilots had had experience stripped away from them for years.
William actually did the math on this. The captain of the Air France flight had logged 346 hours of flying over the past 6 months. But of that time, there were only about 4 hours in which he was actually in control of an airplane, takeoffs and landings. The rest of the time, autopilot was flying the plane. That's 4 hours in 6 months. The co-pilots would have had even less time at the controls.
This is not to say pilots do nothing when autopilot is on. They still have an important role to play.
What do good pilots do in flight? They watch the systems. They handle navigation and communication. They occasionally program things in, flight path changes. They deal with anticipation of weather. They think about fuel management.
Increasingly, Williams says, pilots have become automation managers with fewer and fewer chances to actually fly the plane. He believes this lack of experience at the controls left the pilots of 447 unprepared to take over when the automation turned off.
The pilots were hideously incompetent. I think no one would disagree with that.
So I have certainly heard that position from other people before. I think we all have to be very careful. None of us was there when this actually happened.
That's Nadine Sarter, a systems engineer at the University of Michigan who's studied a lot of aviation accidents related to automation.
My approach to things is different, I guess. These pilots were in that airplane with the passengers, and I'm sure they had every motivation to keep that flight safe. And yet they didn't. So then I try to understand, well, why did they not? Did they not have the right information? Did they not have the proper training?
When one of the co-pilots hauled back on his stick, he pitched the plane into an angle that eventually caused the stall. But it's possible he didn't understand that he was now flying in a different mode, one that would not regulate and smooth out his movements.
This confusion about how the fly-by-wire system responds in different modes is referred to aptly as mode confusion, and it's come up in other accidents. The plane switches into a different mode, and suddenly
pilots find it difficult to understand what's going on at that point. They do not exactly know whether the system is still taking care of the airplane or whether they are in charge now. They don't necessarily understand whether